Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage David Luna, Executive Director of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies, to moderate a strategic dialogue with our esteemed panel.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to participate and an honor for ICAIA to host this important strategic dialogue as part of our extended series with Concordia, in particular to develop and strengthen public-private partnerships to counter illicit economies and related crime convergence and corruption across borders in this summit in the Americas. Let me thank again Concordia for their continued partnership and supports of NGO like the Coalition Against Illicit Economies. Today we have leaders who are represented today in our dialogues who have extensive experience on these issues. We are honored to have with us Steve Francis, who's the Acting Executive Associate Director for Homeland Security Investigations with the Department of Homeland Security, as well as Janio Rosales, the Minister, His Excellency, the Minister of Economy with the Republic of Guatemala, as well as Gastón Schulmeister, Director of the Department Against Transnational Organized Crime with the Organization of American States, Grégoire Verdeaux, the Senior Vice President for External Affairs at Philip Morris International, Mr. Anthony Zook, the Executive Director for Product Integrity at Merck Sharp and Dome, as well as Shad Wolf, the president of Wolf Global Advisors and the former acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and Linda Solano, who is a lawyer on criminal policy and investigations, as well as a former advisor to the Attorney General of Colombia. So thank you all for your commitment, not only to our collective security, but to the rule of law, democracy, and other important issues. Let me just make a couple points, short points, to frame our discussion today. While global communities continue to grapple with the pandemic, inflation, criminal violence, and authoritarian-inspired wars and insecurity, we continue to face complex and evolving threats from a wide range of illicit vectors and bad actors. Illicit supply chains, non-regulated ports, and free trade zones around the world enable cartels and other criminal organizations to transport illegal goods, expand their illicit international trade, export criminality and violence, and launder revenues of their illegal activities. No region is immune from these criminal threats. The severity of today's cross-border illicit threats range from narcotics to the flow of dangerous opioids such as fentanyl, which are killing too many of our young citizens, be it in Chicago or Miami, Guatemala City, Sao Paulo, Lima, and other cities in the region. The homicide rates in Latin America and the Caribbean are among the highest in the world. Firearms and semi-automatic guns, especially from the United States, are contributing to the violence. Corruption, porous borders, and weak institutions create this climate of impunity for criminal activity. While illicit trade was already booming prior to the pandemic, the proliferation of counterfeits has further been accelerated, especially pharmaceutical products, PPE, personal protective equipment, fake medicines, and therapeutics. Criminals continue to prey on the poor and desperate and similarly profit from human trafficking and smuggling, and so many other harms that our economies and countries in the region face today. In fact, the collective global illegal economy constitutes between 7 to 15% of GDP, or several trillion dollars a year. So with that, these important points and these harms and threats, the strategic dialogue today brings together representatives from the public and the private sector to address the negative effects of illicit trade. We will be having an interactive discussion in which our leaders will be building on each other's statements and really to inform the broader communities on today's threats. Let me first turn over, ask Steve Francis, to really share more about how the U.S. Department of Homeland Security is working today, especially in his numerous senior roles and capacities at DHS, and how DHS is working with our partners in the region, not only governments, the private sector as well, to strengthen our collective security to combat these criminal threats. Steve?
All right, David, thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to be alongside our distinguished colleagues. I'm Steve Francis. I'm essentially our acting director for Homeland Security Investigations. I oversee a workforce of over 10,000 employees, 7,000 special agents. HSI is the principal investigative arm of the Department of Homeland Security. We have a very broad mission. We enforce over 400 laws and regulations that's focused on illicit trade, travel, and finance. As you can imagine, there's a lot that I worry about each and every day, but there's nothing more important than the partnerships we have on our international, the private side. Law enforcement, can't do this mission alone. There's 3 areas of focus that, kind of we focus with the Western Hemisphere on, at least in the United States. I'll speak about national security, the illegal exportation of munitions and dual-use technologies, sensitive technologies that are essentially being acquired and stolen by our adversaries, so great partnerships overseas. We're represented in over 90 countries, and we're physically in over 50 countries around the globe. So we've been at the forefront of working with our partners, and essentially what's unique about our authorities is that we're customs officials, so we have the ability to detain, inspect, seize, and also investigate. So it's rare customs authorities that the United States has, at least for HSI. Another area, and David alluded to this, about the public safety threat. There's nothing, I think, more important than what we're focusing now with this opioid and fentanyl crisis, right? In the United States alone, in the last 12 months, we've had over 105,000 overdose deaths. And we see, right, the precursor chemicals coming from China, being sent into Mexico and also being smuggled across into the United States, causing, an incredible amount of concern and also an ability for us to need to be more active with the private sector and working with our international partners in combating this threat and reducing the demand. And also, David, as you're aware, and many of us, about the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw unprecedented amounts of fraud and schemes, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little more. But the ability to work with the private side and also with our international partners with sharing of information and disrupting these transnational organizations. And then lastly, I'll talk about the border security threats. Unfortunately, I think many people are aware of the migrant smuggling operation or smuggling event that occurred with the 53 deaths. That investigation is being led by Homeland Security Investigations. And I know we've had both, we hosted Mexican officials as well as Guatemalan officials in the United States recently to discuss and increase our partnerships together to combat these threats. So human smuggling, trafficking, of course, as we're aware with human trafficking, these vulnerable populations that are being exploited once they come into the interior of the United States into forced labor, human trafficking efforts. So David, we have a lot going on in the U.S., especially within kind of the customs investigative realm. But just to, remind and, ourselves as well that there's so much more that can be done. But we have an incredible partnership overseas as well as with the private sector in combating these efforts.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And it does sound like you're really busy as the acting director of HSI. And you mentioned how you're working with partners like Mexico and Guatemala, and I'm sure many others. Dr. Rosario, you have incredible experience in issues related to sustainable development, corporate social responsibility, and economic development. On the issues of organized crime and corruption, how do these threats really impact your country, Guatemala, and how do they siphon off national assets for your national economic development strategies?
Well, good morning. First of all, it's an honor to be a part of Concordia America Summit. On behalf of our president, Alejandro Yamatei, he sends his greetings and congratulations to the organization. You talk about the very complex issue. I think, first of all, the main aspect of sustainable development issues is to put in first hand the importance of the human, of the persons. So, relating the economy in Central America, we are facing lots of challenges, like our colleague was saying, human smuggling, illicit traffic of products, of commerce, and also drugs. It has been promoting poverty, and as a government, what we are creating is prosperity walls that start with generating more employment, more educational and health opportunities for our people. And we have been working very closely with the U.S. government, and especially with USAID in different aspects. And we think that we also have to work in a more integrated way with all the Central American countries. Now I have the presidency of the economic for the Central American Ministers of Economy, and we have been putting in this agenda to start putting in the center also the sustainability goals, also building these walls of prosperity in Central America, also giving a route for the entrepreneurs, and well, I think we have to address these challenges in a more global way, not only in a political way, but also in the economic way, and also in a social and development way. So that's some of the keys that we are working on right now.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Rosales. Mr. Wolf, across numerous national security circles, not only in the U.S., but in different parts of the region, and I do see that the issue of China's growing influence in South America is also on the agenda later today. As it relates to our issues that we are discussing related to illicit trade, the concern is that China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, is not only helping countries on the economic development, but on the issues of ports and other critical assets that they, through these loans, it has enabled some bad actors to be involved in the operations. How can we engage through public-private partnerships the influence of China in the positive way to counter drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and trade-based money laundering?
Well, thanks, David, and thanks, Concordia, for having me. It's a difficult question, right? This is not an easy one by any stretch, but I think it starts with having a clear-eyed view of the threat I think that China poses. So we talk a lot about their military might, but their economic might, which you just mentioned, is a key element here. We see a lot of systematic theft, at least inside the United States, and I'm sure other countries do, as far as U.S. technology, intellectual property theft, and a lot of other illicit activities coming from China. And so the question is, how do you engage, and how do you alter some behavior if that's what you're going for? And I think there's a couple different ways to do that. You can do that from the government side. President Trump, at least when I served in the last administration, signed a trade agreement with China. Part of that was China's commitment to curb some of the counterfeits coming out of China. We'll see if that's been successful or not. But how do you use sort of the stick and the carrot hand in hand to elicit some activity along that? So obviously President Trump did that through tariffs, but there are probably other ways to do that as well. So I think it's an important point, holding individuals accountable to agreements they signed up for, in this case, as part of that trade deal. I think the private sector has a role here as well. When you have e-commerce platforms like Amazon and others that provide that marketplace for these illicit goods or counterfeits coming out of places like China, I think there's more that they can do, obviously working with governments around the world, including the United States and others, to not provide that marketplace or that platform in a sense. And I know they're doing a lot. There's probably still more that they can do at the end of the day. And then, of course, there's enhanced partnerships. So I think you can try everything you can in your playbook to try to influence China, but I think you're only going to be successful in so far. And so you've got to have these other partnerships with other countries around the world, so that you're able to perhaps stop some of the counterfeits coming out of China, out of those countries into the U.S. and likewise. So I think it's those robust international agreements in cooperation that you have. We talked about fentanyl. You talked about it earlier. We saw that back in 2017 and 2018, and we worked with China, and we actually passed some legislation that cut down on the ability to bring fentanyl into the U.S. through those express consignments, the DHS, the UPSs of the world. And so what have we seen in return? They just simply go to Mexico. and then across that southern border. So there's ways that you've got to, it continues to change. There's not any one thing that you can do and kind of sit back and say, okay, I've fixed the problem. You're going to have to continue to adapt. But those international agreements, the private sector, and then kind of making sure that your partner in this case, or China, I wouldn't say your partner, but China, understands the consequences if they don't act.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well. It was under your leadership that we had this presidential memorandum on combating counterfeits and pirated goods, and how the U.S. interagency can work across borders with our partners. So thank you for that leadership as well. As you, Steve, you were part of that. Grégoire, on the role of private sectors and public-private partnerships, how can we continue to elevate the power of public-private partnerships to combat the illicit trade and related transnational trafficking in places like free trade zones, not only in the Americas, but how they may be interconnected to other free trade zones, be it in the U.S. or in other regions?
Well, thank you, David, and thanks to Concordia for having me. So Philip Morris International indeed is very engaged in the fight against illicit trade, of course, of tobacco and nicotine products for now more than 20 years. And I manage external affairs globally, but I have under me a team of about 100 plus people that are around the world and working with investigators and consultants. So if you wish, that is giving me a little bit of a global outlook on the issue. And before I address your question, let me say very clearly here, we have a problem in this region in particular, and I need to zoom in on the free trade zone, the colon free trade zone, because with Panama, we have literally the world champion of cigarette trafficking. And we need to understand the volume of that issue here. It's about 8 billion stick of cigarette coming in every year through Panama, mostly from Asia, China. And just to give you a sense, that's about the total amount of all illicit cigarettes consumed in Mexico every year. And that has repercussion also in the missing taxes, because obviously the cigarettes pay no tax, and then they spread around the region. About 1/3 of the Dominican Republic market is unfortunately illicit because of these cigarettes. That's a loss of $50 million of taxes every year for the Dominican Republic. That's for Colombia, that's about 750 billion pesos, so around $200 million. So I think we need to take this very seriously. It's not just cigarettes. It's missing taxes fundamentally at a time where post-pandemic a lot of the economies in the region need those taxes. Now, to address your question on free trade zones and what can be done, the key obviously is enforcement, because you have in Panama resolutions that have been adopted. Unfortunately, they have never been enforced. As long as you have cash transaction, as long as you have thresholds for criminal proceedings that are clearly not in sync with reality. Just to give you a sense, there will be no criminal prosecution in Panama if the confiscated goods are less than $500,000. So in the world that is mine, that means no prosecution at all. So obviously we're turning to governments, and that's I think Panama as a government needs foreign investments, and they need to do something about it. That's the only call I could launch today. But obviously the private sector has to also take the matter into its own hands. And here, frankly speaking, this is what we are doing at Philip Morris also by moving away from cigarettes. Innovation, alternatives to cigarette. 2 weeks ago, there was a report from KPMG across the wider Europe, from the UK to Ukraine, on cigarette trafficking. Everywhere where you have a double-digit growth of alternatives to cigarette, illicit trade is coming down. So innovation is part of the response. by companies ourselves making our products better and frankly more difficult to traffic.
Thank you, Grégoire. I do want to continue on this discussion of innovation and how perhaps even technology can really help the governmental partners and how the private sector can partner with governments to more effectively counter that. We'll come back to that in the second round. Gastón, you've heard the importance of law enforcement. Obviously, the Department Against Transnational Organized Crime at the OAS works in the whole array of illicit threats that impact governments in the region. In your experience, what has been the major driver of illicit trade in the Americas, and how does the OAS work diplomatically, but through your training programs as well, to strengthen that capacity?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you. It's a great honor to be here with all of you in this roundtable. From our department against transnational organized crime, as you mentioned, we work very closely with different institutions and officials from the different countries of our region. I would say that maybe something to take into account by definition is that we would say that organized crime needs corruption, and corruption needs organized crime. And as simple as that, if we think about that, we can imagine how challenging it is to fight against this. Because taking into account, for example, the increasing diversification of activities that organized crime is assuming, and together with the high power of adaptation to organized crime, to challenging situations such as the one we face with COVID-19, for example, it gives us the big challenges we are facing, involving the amounts of money, for example, that has been mentioned here, the different challenges mentioned with my colleagues. So, and then in particular, even some high-impact criminal activities, such as, let's say, human trafficking, drug trafficking, or illegal mining, on which we have been working very closely with different actors across the region, require structures of corruption at different levels. And mainly when we talk about particular threats that have actions in remote areas or in borders where the capabilities of states are a bit difficult, I mean, there we have greater challenges to work. So how to deal with this? Obviously, on one hand, I would say that it's important to work in prevention, in the promotion of values across or within our officials, our authorities, but also, of course, it's important to promote and to implement some mechanisms for control, surveillance, and monitoring of actions within the institutions. In this sense, together with this, I will share with you that, just to give you an example, it's important also to identify some particular risks, some particular warning signs. Just to give you an example, as I said, in the case of the project against illegal mining, we have just recently published a regional report on typologies of money laundering associated with illegal mining. We have identified at regional level 16 typologies of money laundering associated with illegal mining, and more than 160 warning signs that should be taken into account for authorities, and not only authorities from the formal authorities or institutions, but also from private sector. I mean, we expect that this kind of document, this kind of information, this sharing of information would be very useful for fighting against organized crime, not only from the state, but also from private sector.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, you underscore the diversification of criminals today. I mean, we've been talking about drugs, fentanyl, counterfeits, human trafficking, and you mentioned mining, but I mean, the diversification gets into a lot of the foremost sectors, from sports to agriculture to you name it. If money can be made, it will gravitate, some of these transnational criminal groups to profit at the expense of, obviously, good communities. Ana Linda, you've worked on strengthening cooperation between the U.S. and Colombia. I know that you specifically have worked on the anti-narcotics strategy between the two countries. How are law enforcement and security agencies responding to the latest effort? And as part of that effort, how are you expanding it to other partners in the region to work with U.S. and Colombia?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Concordia. Precisely, most of what you have said is something that we can focus on Colombia. For example, what comes from China, many of the precursors. So you can say, for example, that the fight isn't in the plant, isn't in the coca cultivation or in the coca plantation, but it is on the whole economy, or the whole, or more than economy, the economic ecosystems that are among all of these. You have, as Dr. Rosario was saying, you have human smuggling, you have human trafficking, you have these people who's small, working on coca cultivations, for example. Many of these illicit goods that come from China on illicit forms, you have that on the production of this. Many of the gold that is illicitly obtained is useful through free trade zones for laundering money. Many of the capital flight that comes from China, for example, and here it's very useful trade-based money laundering. If I say in China that, I don't know, my blouse is $1, and I say to the government China that it's $1, but actually it was $15, and 14 of those are in Cayman Islands. So it is, by all means, very, very complex, systematic. So we say this a lot. We say that all of these crimes are related. We say that these different organizations work in these different topics. We say all that, but how you can translate that, as your question is actually addressing, into a more holistic understanding, first of all, because when we investigate, we focus on the operative, and each of the investigators, as probably Steve knows, each of them takes their own box, as I said. I take corruption, as Gastón was saying, I take human trafficking, the other one takes narcotics, but who's looking at the whole thing, the whole picture? And we lack, at least in Latin America, I think, a lot of, not just analytics, we talk a lot of technology and we need technology information, but also analysis capacity, understanding our threats. And using that knowledge that we have in our operative level into a strategic level to relate with, as Gastón and some of my colleagues have been saying, with a private sector, for example, who can tell us better of how they have been affected. For example, I remember some cases I used to have. I've been the former director of the Economic and Financial Police in Colombia. Some typologies that actually doesn't make any economic sense, like having some products coming from China, coming to Colón, and without any transformation in the process of that product, you go back, I don't know, to Hong Kong, and it costs 100 times more, right? So who can tell you that? Private sector. So you need a lot of confianza, trust in each other. But this is something that is not natural, because public and private sector not naturally trust in each other. But it happens. you know, and Grégoire said that, like, you work together. Also, Gastón was saying that you create those spaces. But I think the biggest question there is how you make that trust sustainable and institutional, you know, that it doesn't depend on the people. I know this colonel or I know the head of this company, but how you make that a sustainable trust. And when you have that, you can exchange information, technology, and all of that that you need in order to make this flow of information that you need in order to understand and go after these threats. But regarding specifically what you were saying about this strategy, we understand this complexity, and as Dr. Rosario was saying, you have to focus on the territory and on the people, but from a different perspective, a holistic perspective. You need to develop the tertiary roads, because how you can aspire that people cultivate something else if any other product can take 3, 4, 5 days through these very difficult roads, through rivers, through so many difficult circumstances. A mango won't do it, you know. I wish, some of them wish they could cultivate mangoes.
Right.
But it's very difficult to transport if you don't have the economic conditions. So unless you create a virtuous economic system to compete with these illicit economies, but to understand them as illicit ecosystem, because in these places you have the narcotics, but you have a illicit supply, I don't know, of beers, because the organizations want these people to invest in their own illicit economies, whatever they gain. You have many women being sexually exploited in these places. You have a lot of things going on there. So unless there are education, like so many other alternative, economic alternative, financial opportunities for another type of enterprise, it's gonna be very difficult. So we have understand that, and we have a holistic plan. I hope I could go in more detail after, but it's kind of the view that we have right now about the problem and a more systemic approach.
Yeah, no, thank you, Annalena. I mean, look, as mentioned, the gravity of the illicit trade and criminalized markets, it just encompasses so much that when you talk about holistic approaches, I think at the beginning of the conference, Matthew was talking about the importance of partnerships to deal with the whole array of issues confronting the region and globally. I do think, you know, taking a holistic approach will be very important, and hopefully we'll get to that as well on possible specific actions that can help. You know, Anthony, at the beginning of COVID-19, you know, since the beginning of COVID-19, there have been increased in counterfeits. You know, the illicit trade was booming, and as I mentioned, it's been further accelerated by e-commerce and online platforms, but especially pharmaceutical products. Not only medicines and vaccines, but we see personal protective equipment. How is Merck working with other industry partners and governments to really, you know, combat the illicit trade more holistically, not only online, but in retail markets?
Well, thank you for the question, and really appreciate the opportunity from Concordia to be invited to this panel. So Merck, as a pharmaceutical company and known outside of the US and Canada as MSD, our mission is to invent and bring to market medicines that save and improve human lives. And unfortunately, those medicines are not immune to issues of illicit trade. And so we see them primarily, certain ones being highly susceptible to this illicit trade. And so within the company, we have a mission within our product integrity unit that is entirely dedicated to protecting patients from the dangers of that illicit and counterfeit medicines. And so if we look at kind of some of the strategic deliverables of that mission, the first is really to protect the supply chain of our legitimate medicines and really identify that and seek to protect that to the greatest extent possible so that our legitimate medicines get to patients in a regulated way. But we also know the organized crime groups that are operating very sophisticated, very high level of capabilities, and they're able to operate outside of that legitimate supply chain. And so we've got a second strategic area where we look at investigations and enforcement on those high-value targets. And so it was mentioned, an intelligence capability, and we can learn a lot about bad actors and a number of targets and threats, and we don't have the ability to engage all of them, but we can prioritize them based on our intelligence collection and really understand what is a high-value target. But when we do so, and we believe strongly that criminal enforcement is the most effective means at abating that threat from an organized crime group, that is not something as a company, as a private sector, that we can do on our own. And so we become entirely reliant on public-private partnerships to enable a law enforcement action. And then from a third part of our strategy would be advocacy and awareness. And so do the stakeholders who are engaged in this problem outside of MSD and even inside MSD, are they fully aware of the issue in a way that helps them inform on their decisions and their areas of responsibility, whether that be a government agency, a health regulator, or a patient? And so those are the areas that we're really trying to engage on. And if we think about the investigations and enforcement activities, as you mentioned, COVID-19 really brought about a unique set of threats because it really pushed people more and more in their daily lives to evaluate and make purchase decisions on e-commerce platforms and on the internet. And that was also true for people's medicines, particularly medicines that were of particular interest during COVID-19. We see this within the vaccine space and now in the COVID-19 therapeutic space. And so we see people now being very driven for these medicines, very high value. They're still being produced in a limited supply, and so there might not be the supply to meet the demand. But we're also seeing, the bad actors take advantage of that demand and creating an illicit supply of those products. And so from a private partnership standpoint, what we've seen, and if we look across the pharmaceutical industry, many companies, their products are being faced with these same kind of illicit activities and illicit trade. And so as MSD, we do not believe that our activities involved in this space are a competitive advantage. And we would share our tactics and our capabilities freely among the industry with our pharmaceutical company peers. And so that ability to engage across companies in a way that's non-competitive really allows us to consolidate intelligence on bad actors and identify perhaps the true scale of the threat and the principal bad actors that we might want to engage on as an industry and really as a collective rather than just as a single company. And again, once we're able to do that, and we have very open dialogues, particularly among the COVID-19 therapeutic manufacturers and vaccine manufacturers, constantly sharing threats among one another, identifying areas of vulnerability, et cetera. And so this really allows us to have a greater emphasis on protecting patients that are now being more and more vulnerable because of the bad actors taking advantage of the COVID-19 situation. And then again, back to our reliance on public-private partnerships as well. So we're very engaged with HSI and the IPR Center, and they are part of a bi-weekly communication among the industry to assess and deliver on threats, intelligence. Is there something that they've seen that we should know about in order to protect our patients? And Linda mentioned it as well. The private industry, so as MSD, we know more about MSD products than anyone else. And so we can authenticate suspected counterfeit MSD products. We know how authentic products are manufactured, how they're distributed, who distributes them, where they are sold. And so that access to information and then technical capabilities with regards to forensic analysis allows us to be a great partner if we have already developed and have those meaningful relationships in place.
Hey, David, let me just comment
Yep.
on what Anthony was saying there as far as that partnership. And I know Steve and others have mentioned it as well. When I was at DHS, whether you're talking about law enforcement or you're talking about technology or whatever the mission is, that partnership between the federal government and the private sector is absolutely critical if you want to have success in whatever area that you're looking at. If you're talking about law enforcement, Steve and others will say, law enforcement thinks they know most, if not everything they need to know. But it's really where the private sector can come in and innovate and provide that technology, provide that state of art, provide additional resources. And it's that close collaboration between the two, I think, that are critical. Obviously, what the U.S. government or any government provides is that intelligence function, but also that investigation and then prosecution, which is critically important, which Anthony mentioned there. So the two absolutely have to work hand in hand. We saw that at Homeland Security, after COVID-19 started, a lot of fraudulent PPE, fraudulent pharmaceuticals. With Steve and others, we launched Operation Stolen Promise. We had a lot of input from the private sector, including Philip Morris really leaned in, and others did as well. That would not have been as successful as it is, and I know there's like a 2.0 starting here, or may have already started. It would not be nearly as successful today if you didn't have that partnership. If the U.S. government tried to go it alone, or private sector said, well, we've got it, let us do our thing, we know our product better than you do. You've got to have that, and so I always looked at when I was at my time at DHS, is how do we break down the barriers? How do we share more information? How do we get private sector folks cleared to view that intelligence? Because they are partners at the end of the day. So I just wanted to emphasize that. I know a number of folks have talked about that, but I just wanted to also emphasize that. I think it's critically important. You can't overlook it enough. Sometimes it's a throwaway line, the partnership, but I found it to be critically important.
And then, David, also, if I can just talk
absolutely.
a little bit about what Chad just discussed. So, 23 years, I was in law enforcement prior to coming to DC and to run the National IPR Center. 99% of my work was done with law enforcement only, right? So I get to the National IPR Center where we have over 25 different partners. Mostly of it was interagency partners. But, as a result of the presidential memorandum on combating the trafficking of counterfeits and pirated goods, we were tasked by the White House and the department to take a better look at ways we can work with private sector. And it really changed and transformed the National IPR Center. We currently have private sector partners that sit alongside us today that are embedded on a day-to-day basis, sharing information. Of course, it's kind of a one-way street, but sharing information with law enforcement for us to combat this illicit trade. We have the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, it couldn't have happened at a better time when the memorandum was issued because the pandemic hit shortly thereafter. But for almost a year, we were sitting on a monthly basis with private sector discussing ways that we were going to help, or they were going to help us implement the strategy and ways that they can be more proactive and do more on online marketplaces. And then fast forward, the pandemic hits. Almost immediately, we knew that there was going to be a kind of global threat to the world because there's a high demand and everyone is seeking the same kind of PPE. That being said, we also looked within Homeland Security investigation and realized we had a lot of silos, right? So how can we knew the threats were going to not only be the illegal importation of goods, counterfeits coming into the United States, the fraud, the cyber threat, our international partnerships. So we established Operation Stolen Promise, which essentially, for the first time, I would argue, we had a global strategy that brought 4 of our divisions together on a day-to-day basis and launched this initiative to be proactive. It never would have happened if we weren't really focused, and the trust was built much earlier than the pandemic. So it resulted in a tremendous amount of, and look, I mean, we also faced challenges of whether the vaccines were going to work and the misinformation out there. So we were very cognizant that an important part of that was not only the private-public sector partnership, but being proactive in an educational and securing the supply chain. So fast forward, we had an incredible relationship with Pfizer, Moderna, Merck, Johnson & Johnson. I mean, you name it, on the pharma side, proactively. We talked about all the fraud, and obviously private sector has a lot of resources and funding to protect their brand. They were sharing that with us on a day-to-day basis, resulting in seizures of websites, preventing fraud, eliminating the misinformation that was out there. So it was really, I always kind of think about it, there's not a lot of great things that happened from the pandemic, but for us and as an organization, now when we look at combating any sort of criminal activity, we're looking outside of the divisions. We're bringing all of our divisions, and we know financial and cyber play and cut across, and actually that's our goals and priorities for the foreseeable future because they cut across all of our investigative portfolio, and that's going to be the future with, embracing technology and innovation. And we're doing that through our innovation lab. We're working with private sector, with a lot of our great contracts out there in the maritime environment with Thomson Reuters, TRSS. There's just a lot of stuff that we're funding and getting supporting us with analyzing that information because the private sector does an incredible job with that too, and they've been doing a lot of that work and supporting our mission as we move towards new priorities, right? With smuggling, the opioid crisis, national security. So it's really just revolutionized a little bit of the way we think as an organization. And so as of this October 1st, the new fiscal year, we're no longer going to just look at arrests, indictments, and convictions. We're going to look at disruptions for the first time in the history of our agency as an enforcement measure, because we realize that we do a lot of disruptions out there, and at times they're equally as important that we're okay with not getting a prosecution or a case accepted for prosecution.
Dr. Rosales, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I think that collective actions and cross-border collaborations between sectors are critical to mitigate harms by illicit trade. For instance, one of the most relevant actions taken by the government of our president is the creation of COINCON. This is a tax fraud and customs control and fight and prevention integration board. As Guatemala Customs Authority SAT, also advisory and consultancy board in Guatemala, COINCON was created as part of the mitigation of contraband and also its effects in the country's economy and its integrated public-private entities has implemented some actions. In 2021, more than $5 million of goods were confiscated from illicit organizations. Also, in 2022, 163 raids have been developed in highways, market, and customs. This allows us to confiscate illegally entry products to the country, such as medicine, clothes, shoes, food products, cigarettes, fuel, and liquor. And also, as a private sector support, that it's a key issue that you were talking about, is Guatemala Chamber of Industry is helping our government to install the first permanent interagency checkpoint. Additionally, has implemented an analysis center against illicit trade for gathering information to help confront with evidence the illicit trade and propose actions to strengthen government entities to fight tax fraud and contraband crimes. And also, we have to be careful with the timelines of the political agenda, because or most of the governments have 4 or 5 years. So we have to think for the next 15 years. So it's like you were saying, it's not an issue of 1 or 2 years. It's an issue to institutionalize these aspects. And also, to build trust, you need time. Trust can also be ruined in a second. So what we think to focus also is in the things that have a more wider vision of the countries and also for the regions. And I think that a key factor is also the U.S. government with the relation that has in all over the area to have the right allies. And I think that the private sector is a key motor for the development of the country. So we need to focus on that. And also the public policies. We need to have, for instance, in Guatemala, we had a framework that is called Guatemala Moving Forward. And it's a framework that we have been working as a Minister of Economy with the private sector for the next 15 years. We want to generate 2 million more employments. And that's the key issue. So you can start to have these walls of prosperity, and you are not going to have people in situation of poverty and in the need to work in the illicit market.
Annalena.
Yeah, this is a very important point. I remember, for example, a very relevant case which HSI regarding fashion police. It's a very well-known case. And it's a trade-based money laundering case, mainly, but not just that. But the importance of this is that we saw that it's not just needed bilateral cooperation, as you were saying, but we need much more. So I think in what Steve was saying, that all of these partnerships and integration, we have to think also as a region, because we have a global threat, but we don't work necessarily as we should together. And there, I think, it's a challenge, because we're used to work, I don't know, Colombia and USA, Colombia and Mexico, for example, now that is very needed, Colombia and Guatemala, but it's much more difficult to work, I don't know, US, Mexico, Colombia, and Guatemala in these multi-agencies groups that we need, as you were saying. We need that interagency cooperation, but we need this international cooperation, but not just the traditional cooperation, formal cooperation, or we say like informal cooperation, we share WhatsApp and all that. No, we need to work together as countries. And for that, we need our customs agencies to have more. Central America have it. It's a great example. But the cases we deal with China, LA in the US, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Colombia, and then follow that money. So we need to understand that we don't just have to work in these bilateral groups where we have a lot of, I don't know, intelligence, economic help from other countries, but somehow we need to share intelligence, understanding, and some other, much more, in terms of creating this. This was a dream, actually, like creating these transnational task forces where we can work as a group. For example, the Ibero-American Network of Prosecutors, IAMP, they have started something called like Grupo de Tareas Especiales. This means that you have prosecutors, for example, for the triple border of Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil. So you have, they work as one team, for example, for illicit goods and for human trafficking, for example. So we need more of that, but not just when you have a prosecutor, you have already a case. When you have, I don't know, law enforcement, intelligence, so you need to grow in that shared understanding and work more as a team, because if you continue to see these relationships, just public-private, one country and another, it won't be enough. And UK have something they started a few years ago. It didn't come to a reality. It was called, it is a public-private partnership called GIMLIT. It works inside the country for money laundering, anti-money laundering, in a strategic and operative level, finance sector and law enforcement. But they were trying to do that in an international level for corruption. We need more initiative, at least regionally, for example, for that, I don't know, regarding trade-based money laundering and some of these common threats that we have.
Yeah, you know, on the crime convergence, as a former U.S. diplomat, you know, working not only within the interagency, and on the issue of stovepiping, certainly pre-9/11, the difficulties of getting, you know, critical agencies to work together. But I found that overseas, that oftentimes anti-corruption agencies were not working with the investigators, were not working with the money laundering. And when you look at some of these interconnections, it does take that holistic, that full spectrum approach to really begin to disrupt and dismantle illicit trade within borders, but also, as I think you started to allude, more cross-border as well. And Steve, at some point, I'll come back to the utility of intelligence fusion centers and whether that can be adopted more regionally. But Grégoire, you want to make an intervention?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the public-private partnership, because obviously I can only agree with what Anthony and Chad have said, but there is a particular liability, if you wish, from the private sector. We can, obviously, the governments have to take action, but we have our own responsibility to act. We cannot just wait, and of course we are asking for regulatory frameworks and enforcement, and that's our role, but let me be specific on a couple of things. The first one is investment. Fundamentally, what is expected from us is to invest, and we can say, you know what, we will just hold on investment for now. Come back to the free trade zone, the Colon free trade zone in Panama. This is not a good situation for Panama to be on the blacklist of the EU, on the grey list there, with a government that is asking for foreign investment. We're going to say, you're going to make a choice here. You have to adopt the right rules, because then this is going to drive to you the investments that that you want. This is constantly the dialogue I have with governments, which is adopt good regulation on alternatives to cigarettes. That is going to drive your illicit down. Do the right thing. That's one thing we can do, which is investment. The other, frankly, is because I was listening to, government official and former officials saying, "Oh, all these silos." Well, we have our own silos, and so there's according to WHO, Roland Berger, you have $200 billion of counterfeit drugs out there. Fundamentally with Merck and Anthony and other pharmaceutical players, but we work on the same things. We work on track and trace, we work on product forensics, we work on investigation, and frankly speaking, there is no real platform across the industries that are most affected by this. If you look at that, it's pharmaceutical, tobacco, beverages, luxury, some consumer products, and we don't really share on a sort of consistent basis. I just wanted to say that because obviously the silos exist beyond the public sector.
Grégoire, let me ask you a question. On the issue of political will, compared to 5 years ago, you mentioned Cologne. Have you seen marked improvement in working with governments and the private sector to combat illicit trade in a free trade zone like Cologne?
Not necessarily on that one, although you had the adoption of a couple of resolutions, which is a good sign. It's good to have words out there, but it's better if they are enforced. What we have seen at the global level is you have a World Organization of Free Trade Zone that is cooperating with OECD. So at least I would say, on a sort of intention level, things are moving a little bit in the right direction. But to be perfectly honest, this is not commensurate with the scale and the pace of illicit trade. Everyone here has mentioned the acceleration that happened with the pandemics, and we know how opportunistic organized crime is. So we need to have a much faster response.
Great, thank you. Gastón, at the OAS, obviously you work with government. What's been your cooperation with Interpol or UNODC or others to leverage, to really, again, do more together to combat, whether it's corruption or illicit trade in some of these sub-regional markets?
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question. We, as an organization, at the hemispheric level, obviously we work together with other counterparts, not only Interpol, not only UNODC. By definition, for example, our department was created in 2016 in order to help the countries to implement the Palermo Convention, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So, taking into account that, we are in touch daily with the different agencies or different offices of UNODC, for example. But apart from that, as I said, together with others, counterpart, international bodies in charge of the fight against money laundering, for example, at the regional level. Obviously, we promote synergies at hemispheric level together with the global efforts that the countries has against organized crime, as it was mentioned by Linda, given the global impact that they have. But in this framework, I wanted to highlight that all what we have been saying regarding the sharing of information, sharing of experiences, I mean, it's something that is not politically correct. I mean, I would like to highlight that this is key for an effective strategy against organized crime. So, as it's important, obviously, to continue working on formal mechanisms, such as the mutual legal assistance mechanisms, that we have to remember that for that also we need the political willingness to be effective. But in complementary to that, I mean, it's important to keep working in informal mechanisms. As it was mentioned, for example, with different networks, with different group of experts. In our case, for all that kind of initiative, we are completely at disposal from the Organization of American States to continue giving these opportunities. Just to give you an example, in the case of money laundering, we have a group of experts, the group of experts against money laundering that is called Shalabex. Then now we are promoting a new network against illegal mining. In fact, we have just our first meeting in Bogota the last week. Different countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Guyana, and Suriname has already been involved in this network. In this kind of opportunities is where we promote actions, and also I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to recognize and to thank, for example, not only the support from the State Department for our project, but also in particular the support of agencies such as Homeland Security, because it's important the work we do together, working with the different countries across the region to see and to think how to continue promoting actions against organized crime. So that's the big picture of the work we are doing, given the challenges we face.
Chad, were you going to raise? Anthony, again, Merck has so much rich experience in working within industry, but across industry, and again, in strengthening effective public-private partnership. I mean, what effective solutions would you recommend for the international community to really take on more seriously?
Mm-hmm. So I think what we've found is, from a private entity standpoint, is really identifying and proactively building those relationships before they become necessary to support an individual investigation or enforcement action. So we would say that the time to make a friend is not when you need a friend. And so we're trying to, in advance, build those relationships. And if we look back at, in the COVID-19 space, MSD does have a COVID-19 therapeutic tablet, capsule. And so when we began to bring it to market, we recognized in advance the risk that it was going to be exposed to. I mentioned also some of the supply and demand imbalances, and so we also licensed it to a number of voluntary license partners and also the WHO Medicines Patent Pool, which then opens up then a number of other risks. And so because of our knowledge of things and our anticipation of risks, we began to mitigate those risks in advance. And so some of the things that we've done is we've engaged more than 28 countries directly with their customs organizations and explained explicitly for the MSD branded product, this is exactly how it will arrive in your country. This is what it will look like. These are the ports that it's coming in. Anything that would fall outside of this would be suspicious, and this is the person at MSD that you would call. And then as it relates to the licensed products within the Medicines Patent Pool, so there are approximately 34 to 36 licensed providers, but our intelligence right now, as of this morning, indicates more than 179 actual manufacturers advertising their product. That is a lot of unlicensed, potentially illicit suppliers. And so we are also bringing that to light. And so we're working with the WHO to help them build a quality testing monograph to help facilitate the safe and effective delivery of these non-MSD versions of this molecule, of this product, because we recognize our ability to engage in that greater good. So now we're helping to protect other generic companies' products because we recognize that that is, in fact, what is necessary. And so if we just look at that overall scenario in a larger sense, do we have good intelligence that helps us identify threats in advance? Have we built those relationships with meaningful stakeholders, in this sense, both the health authorities and the WHO, and also law enforcement agencies and customs agencies, that we can engage proactively in an effort to prevent illicit trade and proactively protect patients? And if we can't prevent it, can we rapidly engage to mitigate it very quickly? And then how do we then replicate that at scale, share that with other industries? And then, as I mentioned, also with our advocacy and awareness, there's a lot of things that we can learn from the tobacco industry. And we have, MSD has a great relationship with PMI. We work together on a number of issues because bad actors are bad actors, and some days it's tobacco, some days it's pharmaceuticals, et cetera. And so we're also involved in a number of trade associations like the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition that bring together like-minded private industries who want to work in a similar way and build those relationships. There's a lot that we have learned from that. And that, again, can also bring together multiple private sector partners to then engage governments. And so we believe that is a real key to success as well.
David, if I may, just talk about two things that I failed to say earlier, but with the private sector, right? How important it is, and I think, Tony, we talked about this. I know PMI does it as well. Motion pictures, you know, we love it when it's handed to us on a silver plate, right? So if the investigation is, you know, pretty darn good to actually, you know, have a law enforcement agency accept it. And I learned this right at the National IPR Center. There was a lot of, you know, brands that had, you know, someone infringing on their brands, right? And they would present a lot of cases. But, you know, of course, you know, the bigger companies have more resources, and it was important for me to be equal. But it's also, as everyone can imagine, there's so many priorities that we have, but it's nice that the information sharing is really, you know, almost ready to present to prosecutors. I remember reading an article one time where one of our partners said, hey, I always hand it to law enforcement on the silver plate. I was thinking, do I take offense to this? But no, I actually love it, that the fact that, you know, our investigators can take it and move forward and then also present it to the field, to a prosecutor, to get that. And another really important note, I think, you know, we talk about disruptions and we talk about investigations, but we also need to be much better proactively with education and awareness on illicit trade, right? I mean, if we could talk about it, and we had a great partnership, and we still do, with PMI. Early on, we signed an MOU about proactively educating the public. I was very surprised, but it was approved by the attorneys at our agency. But we actually were able to, you know, work with you guys on USAIT to educate many states across the United States. Also, you know, publications in the Wall Street Journal, and that had a lot of information in there about illicit activity that's happening with, you know, Operation Stolen Promise. So there's, and then motion pictures, we're doing a lot of public awareness and public service announcements. So it's important, I think, the younger generations need to realize that, you know, buying a counterfeit product online and where that came from. And I think that's the only way we're really going to have a long-term, sustainable, kind of institutionalized this information to our youth, because it's a different market out there now with the way that, you know, things are being bought online and offline. And also, you know, Chad mentioned earlier, right? Everyone needs to do a little more online marketplaces, you know, private sector, law enforcement. We've got to be proactive. You know, I love that, you know, my agents are excited when they seize $1 million worth of counterfeit goods at the ports of entry, but I'm like, hey, it's kind of late now, right? It's great, keep it up, but at the same time, we need to be proactive on the front end and really having a lot more engagement with China on ways and stopping the manufacturing and distribution of those illicit goods that are entering, you know, the global kind of, you know, countries, right? It's entering not just the United States, all around the world with counterfeits and other hazardous products.
So while I have you, Steve, first of all, UACID is the United to Safeguard across America to combat illegal trade, correct? But as a diplomat yourself, as the chair of the OECD Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade, how is that body working in this region and other regions to combat the illicit trade in free trade zones?
So there's a lot of good work that's happening. I mean, it's still kind of in, I think, the initial stages at the you know, the task force on countering illicit trade. The great thing about being part of the OECD is it's a global kind of, you know, platform where we are working with private sector. We're developing a voluntary free trade zone scheme that hopefully will be adopted by free trade zones that will, you know, kind of acknowledge that they are safe, they're sound, that they're willing to share with law enforcement. There's a significant number of different things that we're identifying that we know will be impactful, and then also essentially a trusted free trade zone that will be recognized by countries around the globe to ensure that they are complying with the rules and regulations and the laws in their country. So I think that's a great initiative. I'm very, you know, excited about it, and I think it's moving forward. And David, you know, it's the private sector is playing a significant role in that as well.
Yeah, it's great to hear, and I think business at OECD supports your leadership and the great work that you're doing. And trust, as Annalena mentioned, I think is very critical, not only government to government, government with the private sector, but also obviously with civil society and the public trust. Let me open that up to the audience to see if there's a question or two that we can entertain. So, you know, with the bright lights, not sure I can see, but so do stand up. Maybe I can see that way if you have a question for our panelists. Yes, go ahead. Introduce yourself and.
Rod Katabi. I have a question about maybe a question maybe for Mr. Rosales. I've been investigating for decades on illicit trade, and what I see the biggest challenge of the free trade zone. A lot of countries. Thank you. 1, 2. Yeah, a lot of countries are not ratifying all the protocols with the FTZs. And it's a major issue because you can investigate as long as you want, looking at the illicit trade, but the FTZs don't come on board and work being, like Steve was mentioning, a trusted partner on combating illicit trade. I think we have a major issue. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question. As you were saying, how can we end the corruptive influence and impunity of criminals today? Well, first of all, we need to build, like we were saying, this trust. Also, we have to use these institutions that are already working. For instance, in Guatemala, we have the creation of the country's anti-corruption commission. It's a presidential commission. Also, to eradicate discretion and corruption, we are working in different laws and policies that force the use of information and technology to bring people together to improve public services. Also, we have the approval of the anti-red tape law. The government seeks to reduce time costs and promote more transparency. The implementation also of open data, a national policy, it's also linked with the open government strategy. And also, we need also to focus on the economic agenda, because at the end of the day, if you don't generate the economic opportunities, what you are seeing is a more influence and a growth of crime. And also, that's a sign that the public policies are not working. So what we need to focus on is this interagency work, also in this wider perspective, as Linda was saying, of the countries working together, and also to see this is not a right or left-wing ideological issue. This is a very rational issue, and we need to focus on, and also to have to share this information, all these platforms, and maybe this type of great events like Concordia is doing. We are sharing information that I think none of us has already talked about, and so we need to do more events like this. And like you were saying, we need to focus on the big picture, not only in the juncture issue, not only like we are also seeing is that this country is failing in this, but we are not seeing what the improvements that this country is doing. So we need to focus also in the positive things that we are working as a country and also as a region.
Annalena, please.
Thank you, David. I would like to come back to something Steve was saying about OECD, your question and the group, because something I've learned working with some different OECD groups is that you have a global perspective. That's very useful and very relevant, because you can share that with the group. But we need to find some other focuses of understanding the threats. Coming back to that, for example, it's not the same, the problems that we have with free trade zones. For example, what happened in Europe and what happened in Latin America, because our frontiers are very different. So the vulnerabilities that we have in our territory, for example, are different because you have, I don't know, in Europe they're more closed, you have different controls, but here in Colombia, for example, you have a lot of unprotected frontiers, for example. So that vulnerability that you have it in so many other ways, not just with the free trade zone. So, or for example, like, you can have that differences in so many different dimensions. So understand, like having countries as Colombia and many Latin American countries in this type of groups give you like different dimensions and perspectives of the problems that you address. Because, for example, when we talk about free trade zones, we're talking not just about illicit trade, but we're talking about corruption, we're talking about money laundering and all that. But and we can discuss in an OECD level, like, for example, we need more electronic bills, we need more share of information, we need that's very relevant. But for example, when you can when you decide, for example, which piece of land it's going to become a free trade zone, that could be a corruption risk that you have there in some of our countries. When you decide on a specific economic sector that's going to have a free trade zone, you could be favoring this sector and having some competence, for example, difficulties there. So I think that you have, or the risk of corruption are like it's multidimensional. So thinking, when we're thinking these risks, we need to think it as it happened in the free trade zone, which is what we usually address, but also more, again, systemically, in order to understand when we take this type of decision, or for example, tax decisions, how they influence not just better commerce, but also facilitate some of the storage capacities or so many other things that end up facilitating this illicit economy. So when we address these discussions, I think we have to have those two dimensions, at least those two dimensions.
Thank you, Linda. Chad, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of go back to the education piece. I think that's critically important. Everyone around the table, whether you're in government or the private sector, you want to fix the problem in front of you, and I think that's fine. I think it's important, though, to continue to communicate out to a larger audience, and I know USAID is doing this and others are doing this, about the threats out there on counterfeit and illicit goods, right? There's the physical threat. These counterfeit goods and products hurt people at the end of the day. There's the economic threat, right? It's hurting businesses, their bottom line, but it's also loss of taxes for economies and the like. And economic security is national security for not only for the United States, but for many other countries. And then there's obviously the national security piece, which we haven't talked a lot about, but it's financing a lot of these terrorist organizations and groups out there, this illicit narcotic sales and the like. And so I think continuing to hit on that to reach a broader and a larger audience, the family, the mother, the father, who clicks on that, who goes onto Amazon and clicks on that product, how do we get them to think about, well, maybe I should look a little bit further into who I'm buying this from and what does that mean? And what are the effects that my actions are gonna take? And then let me just say from being former government, I think one of the roles the government has, and I think they can do it well, is provide that leadership. So we talk about, when I was able to serve, we had a presidential memorandum that put a focus on this. That is providing leadership to it, and then it gets not only others in the government excited about it, it gets the private sector excited. You want to come to the table. You want to be part of the solution. So I think we certainly did that, but every administration and every government, you need to keep innovating. You need to keep finding what is that next initiative, what is that next solution, and continuing to push and not just say, hey, we've got a good program that's been working for 6 years. Let's continue to do it. I think that's good, but you gotta. I think one role that government can provide, whether it's the U.S. or any of the others, is providing that leadership to tackle the problem, to identify the problem, and to be that convening factor to bring private sector and other governments to the table and say, how do we do this in a good way?
Yeah, I do think the communities do need to make more of an effort to educate on the impacts and the harms of illicit trade, because it's not only economic, as you point out, but it's also the health and safety, as Steve was talking about, but the environmental impacts and others, and on terrorism. Thank you for pointing that out. The U.S. State Department in recent years has highlighted how terrorists are gravitating to different aspects of the illicit trade to really, finance their operations and infrastructures, from the tri-border area to Afghanistan to Syria and other parts of the world. So I think that's often one of the bad actors that isn't discussed as much, and I think that's key. And Steve, in the last 5 minutes that we have, but one of the points that I wanted, one of the areas that I wanted to get your perspectives relates to criminalized ports, and we read about how some of the cartels in Mexico are infiltrating and penetrating some of these ports. How do we, encourage the Mexican government? How do we encourage other governments to really work with the U.S. and other international partners to combat some of these national security areas that Chad was mentioning?
So I'll speak to it from a law enforcement perspective. We have an extremely robust TCIU, transnational criminal investigative units, that are embedded in many countries in the Western Hemisphere. Specifically in Mexico, I think it's our largest footprint. So we work extremely closely. Obviously, we're guests of that host country, but our missions align, right, in kind of the law enforcement perspective on combating corruption, terrorism, and then leveraging, right, our authorities that we have in the United States. We have trade agreements. We have a lot of trade agreements with many countries on our trade transparency units that are sharing trade data to combat, probably one of the most challenging things we can do in financial investigations is trade-based money laundering. So I think our ability to essentially, work across the globe. I mean, we're a global agency, right, with, far reach, and we saw that recently with sanctions. But it's these relationships that have been built for so long, David, that when we're calling or our embedded units are there and working alongside one another at the embassy with our foreign service nationals, and we're identifying a threat that is of interest to both countries, there's almost immediate action. And I think just incredible relationship. Obviously, we respect the laws of the host countries, and we work and we try to drive what the priorities are. And in almost all the cases, our priorities align, HSI's priorities align with the host governments, especially when we're dealing with the top priorities of what they're trying to combat. So, and it enables us to go into these ports, right? It enables us to go really essentially anywhere with our customs officers or national police.
Thanks, Steve. A couple minutes left. Any other points that anyone would like to make? Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
So just to follow up on what Steve said, we found great value in leveraging HSI's assets overseas through the attachés, particularly in countries, you mentioned Mexico, and some other countries also that are difficult to work in, but the opportunity that the attachés can provide is access to vetted local units, both from a health authority standpoint. Again, we're very focused on health authorities as a pharmaceutical company, but other law enforcement agencies that they have engagement with, and then we have an extensive engagement through the attaché as well, and then we can begin to leverage those relationships. So it gets back to that trust and those relationships, and so we have found a great success in being able to do that. And again, it's not something that was by happenstance. It was something that was cultivated in advance through that relationship building and through training as well. So not only are we going outside and trying to train external partners and stakeholders about that, we're also training ourselves to know what are the criminal statutes and what are the necessary limits that might need to be met or exceeded in order to generate prosecution. Colombia is a great example, very, very successful. Criminal investigations and prosecutions in Colombia, really a model for the region and one that we would like to see spread as well. And because we are very enforcement driven, but recognize that that's something that we can't do on our own, we rely on other people, we want to be very well versed in what is necessary to make that happen and then supply it, put it on that silver platter. But it is, in countries that are difficult to engage, there might be a U.S. nexus or an attaché that can be involved. Embassies have been very helpful for us.
Regard.
I think, this panel has covered really a lot of ground, but the thing that is striking me most is what Linda said about, making the trust sustainable. Because it's true that trust can be built gradually on an interpersonal level because you know X, you know Y, and you exchange, but fundamentally that is putting our whole cooperation at risk whenever someone is moving away, and frankly in the private sector, well, you change job. So that's really something that would be what I take really is how do we build the tools that make the trust sustainable, because we know very well that the bad actors on the other side are unfortunately, they're extremely good at being bad, and they're very fast and they're opportunistic, but there is not the same amount of trust. And so maybe the thing we have that they don't have is this ability to trust each other.
Great. I think that was a great summation. Our last two speakers on trust and the holistic approach. I know the general from the Southcom, Laura Richardson, will be here later today to talk about what DoD is also doing and working with our partners in the region. And I do encourage our government partners to take advantage of our law enforcement working groups at the embassies, where they are working with HSI, FBI, DOJ, and many others. Colleagues, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel and our panelists and our leaders who are working to strengthen public-private partnerships across the region.